For Southeast Asia, 2026 is becoming a year defined by pressure, uncertainty, and difficult economic decisions. So across the region, governments are now confronting a combination of rising energy prices, inflation concerns, shipping disruptions, and growing geopolitical instability that is beginning to directly affect regional economies. What once looked like distant international crises are now becoming local economic problems for millions of people across ASEAN. That is exactly why the coming weeks may become one of the most important periods for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations this year. Only weeks after leaders gathered for the 48th ASEAN Summit in Cebu, senior economic officials from across Southeast Asia are preparing to meet once again in the Philippines. This time, however, the focus is expected to shift away from ceremonial diplomacy and toward implementation. The upcoming meetings in Legazpi City from May 27 to June 2 are expected to focus heavily on practical economy, coordination, energy security, trade resilience, supply chain continuity, and regional economic integration. For ASEAN, the challenge is becoming increasingly urgent. The Philippines currently serves as ASEAN chair for 2026 under the regional theme, Navigating Our Future Together. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has used the chairmanship to push ASEAN towards stronger regional coordination during a period of growing global instability. At the summit in Cebu earlier this month, ASEAN leaders openly acknowledged that Southeast Asia is facing serious economic risks linked to the ongoing Middle East crisis, unstable global energy markets, maritime disruptions, and inflationary pressure. Regional leaders warned that tensions in the Middle East are already affecting energy markets and critical shipping corridors that Southeast Asian economies depend on for trade, manufacturing, transportation, and imported fuel supplies. For ASEAN governments, this is not simply a foreign policy issue. It is an economic survival issue. Many Southeast Asian economies rely heavily on imported oil and uninterrupted maritime trade routes. Any disruption involving global shipping lanes or fuel supplies can rapidly increase transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, electricity prices, and inflation throughout the region. One of the biggest concerns discussed during the Cebu summit involved the possibility of prolonged disruptions affecting energy transportation routes, especially around the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow waterway remains one of the world's most important oil transit corridors. Any instability affecting oil flows through the region can immediately influence global energy prices, including throughout Southeast Asia. ASEAN leaders understand that if oil prices continue rising sharply, the economic consequences could spread quickly across the region. Transportation becomes more expensive. Food distribution costs rise. Manufacturing operations face additional pressure. Small b unicinesses struggle with operating costs, and governments are forced to manage growing public frustration linked to inflation. That is why energy security became one of the dominant issues during the summit discussions. ASEAN ministers reportedly began discussing practical, concrete response measures designed to strengthen regional energy resilience and food security as concerns over the global economic situation intensified. One of the most significant proposals emerging from the Cebu summit was the push for a regional fuel-sharing framework. The proposal would allow ASEAN member states to coordinate fuel support during emergencies involving major supply disruptions or energy shortages. Leaders see the idea as an important step toward regional resilience, especially as external economic shocks become more frequent. But despite strong political support for the concept, ASEAN officials also admitted that major operational questions still remain unresolved. Officials must still determine how fuel would actually be distributed during emergencies, how payment systems would function, which countries would contribute the most resources, and how financial burdens would be shared among economies with very different fiscal capacities. And that is exactly why the upcoming Legazpi meetings matter so much. Unlike the Leaders Summit in Cebu, where discussions focus largely on strategic direction and political messaging, the Legazpi meetings are expected to focus on technical negotiations and implementation planning. This is where ASEAN officials will begin addressing the difficult details behind the promises. Trade resilience is expected to become one of the central topics. Southeast Asia depends heavily on exports, manufacturing networks, global shipping, and integrated supply chains. If geopolitical tensions continue disrupting maritime routes and trade corridors, ASEAN economies could face major economic consequences. That is why officials are expected to discuss new MEAs, involving customs coordination, digital trade systems, supply chain continuity, and intra-ASEAN economic cooperation. There is growing recognition inside ASEAN that the region may need stronger internal economic coordination to reduce vulnerability during future global disruptions. The Philippines is also attempting to push ASEAN toward more practical regional cooperation beyond economics alone. One major proposal involves the establishment of an ASEAN Maritime Center in the Philippines. According to Philippine officials, the center would help strengthen regional maritime coordination, improve cooperation involving navigation and maritime stability, and support broader regional security coordination. The proposal reflects a much larger strategic reality facing Southeast Asia. Today, economic security and maritime security are now becoming deeply interconnected. Much of ASEAN's trade moves through strategically sensitive waterways, especially the South China Sea. Any instability affecting those routes could immediately disrupt shipping schedules, energy transportation, manufacturing supply chains, and regional commerce. That is one reason why ASEAN leaders continue emphasizing the importance of maintaining stable maritime routes and peaceful dispute management. The South China Sea remains one of the region's most sensitive geopolitical flashpoints. ASEAN governments continue trying to balance relations with China, the United States, Japan, and other major powers while avoiding direct confrontation. But maintaining that balance is becoming increasingly difficult. The Philippines, in particular, has been pushing for stronger regional coordination involving maritime issues while still emphasizing diplomacy and regional stability. ASEAN leaders have continued reaffirming support for a rules-based regional order, peaceful dialogue, and ongoing negotiations toward a code of conduct for the South China Sea. At the same time, economic pressure is forcing ASEAN governments to think more seriously about long-term resilience. The summit in Cebu also highlighted another major regional priority, implementation of the ASEAN Economic Community Strategic Plan 2026 to 2030. ASEAN leaders described 2026 as a critical phase for transforming long-term regional goals into practical policy action. For years, ASEAN has often faced criticism for moving too slowly during major crises. Leaders regularly issue strong declarations supporting cooperation and integration, but turning those statements into operational systems has always been the more difficult challenge. Now, however, the pressure for implementation is increasing. Global economic disruptions are spreading faster than before. Energy crises can trigger inflation within weeks. Shipping disruptions can affect manufacturing sectors almost immediately. Supply chain interruptions can create economic instability across multiple countries at the same time. And ASEAN governments understand that delays could become costly. That reality is changing the tone of regional discussions. Instead of focusing only on broad diplomatic statements, officials are now under growing pressure to produce measurable results involving energy coordination, trade facilitation, economic resilience, and crisis management. Another major issue expected to receive attention during the Legacy meetings is support for micro, small, and medium enterprises, commonly known as MSMEs. These businesses account for roughly 95% of enterprises across Southeast Asia and remain essential to employment and economic activity throughout the region. But they are also among the most vulnerable during periods of instability. Rising transportation costs, inflation, shipping delays, and supply disruptions can severely affect smaller businesses that lack large financial reserves. ASEAN leaders have therefore emphasized the importance of protecting MSMEs through improved financing access, digital transformation support, and stronger regional trade participation. For many governments, supporting these businesses is not only an economic priority, but also a political necessity. Across Southeast Asia, ordinary citizens are already feeling pressure from rising living costs and economic uncertainty. Governments understand that prolonged instability could eventually create deeper political and social pressure if economic conditions continue worsening. That is one reason ASEAN is now emphasizing resilience so heavily. The Philippines itself has attempted to frame its ASEAN chairmanship around practical cooperation rather than symbolic diplomacy alone. Earlier this year, this Philippine officials even scaled down portions of ASEAN-related meetings and shifted some preparatory discussions online as part of broader energy saving and cost reduction measures during the ongoing regional energy concerns. But despite those adjustments, ASEAN leaders still considered direct negotiations necessary because of the seriousness of the current G-Bull situation. The Cebu summit may have produced ambitious proposals and strong political messaging, but the harder phase is now beginning. Senior officials gathering in Legazpi will face the difficult task of converting regional declarations into operational systems that can actually function during future crises. That will not be easy. ASEAN consists of economies with different levels of development, different political priorities, different energy dependencies, and different relationships with major global powers. Some member states are heavily dependent on imported fuel. Others possess greater fiscal flexibility. Some rely deeply on Chinese trade and investment. Others maintain stronger security partnerships with the United States or Japan. Coordinating unified regional responses under those conditions is always complicated. Still, ASEAN leaders continue insisting that regional unity remains essential. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has repeatedly emphasized that Southeast Asia should strengthen cooperation instead of allowing external crises to divide the region. And increasingly, ASEAN governments appear to understand that the region may need faster and more practical coordination mechanisms than it relied on in the past. For decades, ASEAN's strength has largely come from consensus building, gradual diplomacy, and regional stability. But today's global crises are unfolding much faster than traditional diplomatic processes. From Timur Crescent's pressures emerge quickly. Shipping disruptions affect manufacturing networks almost immediately. That changing reality is forcing ASEAN to adapt. The upcoming Legazpi meetings may not attract the same international attention as the Cebu summit. There will likely be fewer headlines and less political spectacle. But behind closed doors, some of the region's most important economic discussions of the year are about to begin. Officials will discuss trade resilience, maritime stability, energy coordination, digital systems, supply chain continuity, and long-term regional integration. And the outcome of those discussions could shape how Southeast Asia responds to one of the most uncertain global periods in recent years. For ASEAN, the era of simply recognizing risks may now be ending. The pressure today is no longer about awareness. It is about action. And over the coming weeks, Southeast Asia may discover whether ASEAN can move quickly enough to protect the region before the next global shock arrives.